How you going, everyone? If you haven't already met me, my name's Nat. I'm here to introduce to you guys an absolutely fantastic person in public policy here in Australia, Chris Berg. Oh my God, Chris is the Director of Policy at the Institute of Public Affairs and you guys might see him, I see him often on Sky News and writing wonderful articles, and in particular I really enjoyed your book on defence of freedom of speech, which I highly recommend to everyone.
Is this after me? Can I just
Yeah,
fantastic. Okay. I do notice that we've got uTorrent up there. So George Brandis is going to have a word.
We're supposed to tell him what to do.
Yeah, I wish. We try telling him what to do all the time. All the time, we have no idea. But usually it's through the medium of press releases. So just have to excuse me for a moment.
Joker also lent us the camera for this weekend, so
Yay.
there's another thing.
Magnificent. Anyway, thank you very much for asking me to speak. It's a real pleasure. This is a fantastic little program and a fantastic little initiative because Students for Liberty has been a huge success around the world, as you all know. And I'm delighted that we can start bringing down these sorts of student-initiated programs to Australia. It is incredibly important to build up young people to talk about free markets among other students, and more importantly, from a perspective of the liberty movement in general, it's fantastic to be able to have people coming up from the ground, but also entirely from a self-interested reason. It's fantastic to be able to identify libertarians, classical liberals at such an early age so that we can employ them and get them to write for us, which is just, my job. So the last time I spoke to a group about freedom of speech, just a presentation about freedom of speech, it was a very, very different organisation. It was the New South Wales Union Movement, who I'm very close to. We had a, I don't know whether you followed this, the Unions New South Wales case, which was a recent freedom of speech case last year. It was a huge win for free speech, and they were on the right side, and we were on side with them as much as possible. But unfortunately, last time I spoke to them, I was brought down to talk about 18C, that they were somewhat more hostile. So feel free to throw in, devil's advocate questions at any time. I've called this How to Think About Freedom of Speech because that's incredibly important, and when you go on the radio or TV or I write my columns, you don't really get an opportunity to talk about the sort of basic philosophical ideas. But they're incredibly important because otherwise you're not going to understand where to line up on certain issues, or where you think I'm wrong, or where you think our weaknesses are, or where you think the argument can be nuanced and so forth. So a lot to talk about too. Hey, that didn't work as it should. Nope. Okay. Chris. Sorry.
If you keep the mouse on the arrow on the bottom.
Sorry?
Press the arrow.
If it's maximized, keep the mouse on the arrow, not on the screen. Because if you click the screen, it'll minimize. So do you see the arrows at the bottom there?
Yes?
I think if you click those, that'll look instead of minimizing it.
Nope.
That's all.
It works. Two ideas of freedom of speech. Okay. I'm going to contrast two ideas of freedom of speech. This is the task I do in the book, but they're incredibly important and I think quite revealing ways to think about it, and we can see these ideas transform across all the way to, the recent freedom of political communication debate in the High Court. The ancient Greek version is the first one historically and conceptually. The ancient Greeks were very informed by or very aware of a story in the Iliad when they thought about their relationship to the state and their relationship to each other. And in this story, it's in the middle of the Battle of Troy. And the great kings, King Agamemnon, who is pictured apparently there, King Agamemnon and the great kings, and Odysseus is one of them, are all having a huddle together. And they're trying to figure out, what are we going to do next and how are we going to win this battle. And the ugliest soldier in the army comes up to them, just strolls up to this group of huddling kings. And Homer spends many, many words telling us how disgusting this soldier is. He is the lowest of the low. He comes right in, he barges right into the huddle. And he starts spouting off about how terrible the war is. Why are we in this war? Are we in this war, Agamemnon and Odysseus, because you are greedy? Are we in this just for your own personal gain? All the kings look at him. And they beat him up. They take their scepters and they take their weapons and they just kick the shit out of him. And he walks away in shame. All for just saying, Homer goes out of his way to stress, all for just saying what everyone else was thinking. The problem, the norm that he had breached then, was talking back to his betters. He was just a lowly, not just a lowly soldier, but the ugliest soldier in the army. Now, when the ancient Athenians are thinking about the story, a couple of hundred years later, they're reading Homer like we would read Shakespeare. That's what they remembered. That was the difference that they remembered between then and now, because they had a totally different idea of the relationship between state and citizen, the relationship between citizen and citizen. They had what they saw as freedom of speech. Thersites would never get beaten up in ancient Athens anymore because they got rid of that sort of hierarchical value. They called their word for freedom of speech, or what is translated as freedom of speech, is called Horatia. And they thought this was a foundational idea in the ancient Athenian world. And there's a quote from Achilles, the Persians, which emphasizes how much they thought freedom of speech was such a basic part of their worldview, of their citizenship in Athens. Now, fear no more shall bridle speech and perfect common tongue shall pray. Now, this is all pretty basic stuff. This is all pretty pro Athens, as you can imagine. Except, of course, this happened. They tried and killed their greatest philosopher in 399. 500 jurors had a trial where they tried him for what we sometimes think it was something like treason or something along those lines, and they insisted that unless he recanted, he drink hemlock and basically kill himself. So how do we bridge this gap? How do we understand free speech, yet they're also willing to kill their greatest philosopher, or what we now know as their greatest philosopher? Well, the thing is, their idea of freedom of speech wasn't what we think of as freedom of speech. It wasn't what I think of as freedom of speech. It wasn't an individual right. It wasn't something that you and I have as individuals. It was the community's right. It had a very specific purpose, which was to allow the community to debate issues, and no more than that. It was to allow Thersites to come up to his kings and tell the kings with all frankness and honesty that this was a terrible war they were in for greed. It was not there for someone like Socrates. And now what's special about Socrates is that he's a pain in the arse. He's an incredibly frustrating person to talk to. You've heard of the Socratic method. Well, basically the Socratic method means that you keep challenging with questions and challenging presumptions. And the Athenians, or at least the Athenians that took charges up against Socrates was just playing with us. He wasn't being open and frank like Thersites was. He wasn't helping the democratic community move forward and become a better democratic community. He was just being a right pain. He was just acting up. In fact, he was being almost anarchistic. He was undermining the Athenian democratic consensus. So they tried him and he refused to recant it, so he committed suicide. Michel Foucault, who is a French philosopher that is not much loved by my conservative friends, describes Courageois as frank speech rather than free speech. The idea behind this is an ancient Greek phrase that, of course, is like calling a spade, calls a fig, and a trough. The idea being that you have to be honest and open and reasonable, because the reason that we want free speech is because we need to maintain our democratic community or some sort of communal organisation. That's the ancient Greek idea of freedom of speech. The ancient Roman one was slightly different. Now, I don't want to overstate this too much, but it was different in a very important way. They called it libertas. Now, libertas is unfortunately really hard to translate as well, and one of the reasons it's hard to translate is everybody said they were acting in defence of libertas. Both Caesar and Caesar's executioners believed they were standing up for libertas. It's like the left and the right saying they stand up for freedom, or they stand up for equality and fairness. But nevertheless, libertas was supposed to be the founding idea of the Roman citizen. Now, it wasn't an individual right per se, it was a right for citizens. If you were an individual citizen, you had these rights. Slaves, foreigners, I'll do that again. But the way they thought of libertas was not in that democratic way that the Greek did. It was in a much more individualistic way, as you can see from the quotes from Cicero and Tacitus. I particularly like the Tacitus one. To be a Roman citizen is when you're allowed to think what you please and to say what you think. That's a much deeper and much more important and much more significant idea than the ancient Greek one. So we've got two models. We've got the democratic model in Athens, and we've got the individualistic one, or I'd like to call it the liberty one, in ancient Rome. The distinctions are quite substantial. You in Rome have freedom of speech because you're an individual. In Athens, you have freedom of speech because the democratic community requires you to have freedom of speech for its own interest and for its own continuation. We'll see this all the way to today. Freedom of speech died in ancient Rome when the Republic died, by and large. They had actually rather substantial censorship, and the history of freedom of speech sort of collapses. We've got great stories from ancient Roman authors about how that happened. It builds up again in the early Christian era. That's a quite late execution of martyrs. But as you well know, the development of the Christian world came, with a great deal of punishment for heresy and so on and so forth. John Stuart Mill points out in the quote just above that the freedom of religion was the most important freedom for the vast majority of human civilization, in fact. Because freedom of religion, or religious belief, was what people thought was most important. And so the idea that you would believe something, and the idea that the government or the state or the church would stop you from believing that or punish you for believing your own individual religious beliefs, was the most significant thing for liberals, who were vilified until at least the 15th century. So when we look for the origins of freedom of speech, we have to look for it in, or the origins of our modern ideas of freedom of speech, we have to look for it in the persecution stories of the early and Middle Ages. The reason that this is significant and important is because it contextualized the debate over freedom of speech as a debate over individual belief. Freedom of speech is important in my view because it is the outpouring, it is the outside manifestation of a much deeper freedom and a much more critical freedom and a much philosophical freedom, which is the freedom of conscience, the freedom of belief, the freedom of thought. It is our thoughts that make us individuals. It is our values and preferences and ideas that make us unique from each other. They make us morally significant. They make us participants in a broader community, and they allow us to have relationships. As this Themisius was a pagan philosopher, and he was a pagan courtier to the Roman Emperor Jovian, and he points out that the freedom of thought is a necessary foundation of the freedom of a political freedom of any political community as well. So anyway, in my view, you have to start with freedom of belief. Freedom of belief leads us to freedom of speech, but it doesn't lead us to where we need to go. Because of course freedom of speech is incredibly controversial, and we have these discussions about where we should draw the line. Nobody believes in unfettered freedom of speech, or so I read in the newspaper. And the first one that they believe, that they argue is, so I talk to these human rights academics, and you think human rights academics are actually apparently not. And they'll always say, well, freedom of speech isn't unfettered. I agree with you. Freedom of speech is an incredibly foundational value. And we need to protect it as much as possible. But it has limits. You can't shout fire without theatre. You hear this all the time. It's a fantastic little quote, and we all think it makes a great deal of sense. I'd just like to briefly talk about this quote for a moment, because it demonstrates the way these sorts of things get manipulated outside their natural limitations, and demonstrates the sort of public choice aspects to freedom of speech. So there's a couple of things to say about you can't shout fire in a crowded theatre. You can shout fire in a crowded theatre if there's a fire. You have to shout fire in a crowded theatre if there's a fire. You can shout fire in a crowded theatre if you think there's a fire. There might not be a fire, but if you legitimately think there's a fire, sure, shout fire. The origin of this quote comes from a 1919 case under the Espionage Act in the United States. Schenck versus the United States. Charles Schenck was a member of the Socialist Party of America. What he was doing was handing out anti-conscription flyers in Philadelphia, and which basically said, this is one of them here, asserted rights, quoted the Constitution, said, well, they can't conscript us, feel free to be to reject their attempts to do so. We're going to have a socialist revolution anyway in the future. This came all the way to the Supreme Court. Bear in mind that the First Amendment was not what we think of the First Amendment at that stage. It was actually quite restricted, or at least the way it's been interpreted was quite restrictive. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was then Chief Justice, made the let's not shout fire in a crowded theatre analogy, because of course the fire, in his metaphor, was the Constitution. And the crowded theatre was the First World War. This is outside. This case came after the First World War, of course. But the idea that we are thrown, I get this all the time, the idea that you're thrown back this, you can't shout fire in a crowded theatre, when that's the exact sort of metaphor that is used to suppress anti-conscription speech during wartime. Conscription being, basically servitude for the military. Just shows you how weakly and loosely people have these conversations about freedom of speech. So where do we draw the line? If you can shout fire in a crowded theatre, if there's a fire, but you can't shout fire in a crowded theatre because where does the line get drawn? John Stuart Mill used a example of a corn dealer and people who opposed the corn, of course, being a British word for grains at the time. John Stuart Mill said, it's fine for you to write in the newspaper that corn dealers are starving the poor, that they're the enemy of the working class, and so on and so forth. In fact, it's fine for you to shout on the rooftops, it's fine for you to give speeches, it's fine for you to do it in marches. You can say the most terrible, disgusting things you want about the corn dealer. But the one thing that you can't do is shout it to the screaming mob outside the corn dealer's house as they are preparing to attack the corn dealer. The distinction here, and this is what the First Amendment has used, imminent lawless action, is when speech crosses the line into action. It is an incredibly marginal distinction we're talking about here, but it is an important one. But in my view, it is the only one when speech turns into action. The First Amendment, the advantage of having the First Amendment in the United States, unlike what we have, is that they've spent a huge amount of time thinking about jurisprudence surrounding freedom of speech. And they've decided, well, imminent lawless action. If something is likely to spark imminent lawless action, then it doesn't get First Amendment protection. You may have seen about a year ago the Muslim protests in Sydney, I think it was, and there was a couple of signs that had behead all those who insult Islam. People say, well, that's a direct threat and so forth. Well, probably wasn't, or at least it might have been a threat, but it probably wasn't a lawless threat under First Amendment jurisprudence, certainly not, because it would be an imminent lawless action.
I guess it's going into basically the territory almost as, well, it's not quite assault, it's a little bit broader than assault in the sense of a threat of violence, as in, if I say to you, I'm holding a gun, I haven't shot the gun, but I say, I'll shoot you if you don't do X.
Yep.
That's a crime in the sense that you're threatening with violence.
Blackmail is a crime, all these sorts of things. So when you talk about, so the reason I'm doing this is because we have a habit in Australia of starting from the exceptions and going backwards from there. So everybody says, okay, well, there are lots of things which are against the law. You can't do, fraud, defamation, sedition, racial discrimination, as the case might be, so on and so forth. So obviously freedom of speech isn't an absolute. I think it's more important to actually start from absolute freedom of speech and try to figure out where one would actually draw the line. Because if you share my view, along with the Romans and the religious liberals, that freedom of speech is absolutely foundational to your very individuality, then we have to start reasoning out why you would restrict it ever at all. And that is one of the examples. So blackmail or direct threats, I'm going to shoot you, I think the police should be able to intervene in that case. But all you've done is said things. And there are other examples, of course. Stalking. All you're doing is, imagine just following someone around everywhere they went, just insulting them the whole time, in like really scary ways. You're a huge guy and all that sort of thing. No, the whole time. That's completely illegal, and it certainly should be. There are very strong stalking laws around the world, but all that's happened is speech. So we have to draw a line, and that becomes sort of speech turns into action. Stops being speech. I'm not saying that this is a particularly easy line to draw, and I know this is a quite marginal and conceptual line, but it is an incredibly important one, and you have to think about it that way. The guy who came up with this, in my view, was Benedict de Spinoza, who you may or may not have heard, a Dutch Jew who was kicked out of Judaism. Excommunicated, because they thought he was an atheist. He might have been, sort of hard to tell from here, but anyway, he's a 17th century writer, and he's one of the great liberals that you probably don't hear much about, but one of the most incredible liberals in the middle of the Dutch Golden Age, and he made this argument in relation to sedition, as you can see there. Man's loyalty to the state should be judged like his loyalty to God from his actions only. They might say lots of seditious things, but until they actually start going to war against the state. Yeah, so you got a question?
Yeah, just on the sign and imminent action. So people at protests have the signs saying behead all the blah people. If someone then, from potentially another part of the community follows through on those actions, does the sign become illegal?
No. No. Look, if it was behead all that guy who insults Islam, and there's other people with knives and shit. But when it comes down to urging violence against someone else, in that abstract sense, isn't illegal, and I don't think should be illegal. So there was an example of a really shocking guy, really terrible guy, called Bilal Kazam, who was jailed, I think 2 years ago. What he did was copy a bunch of terrorist manuals off the internet, build them into a little ebook, wrote a 100-word preface, posted it on the internet, and the federal police came after him. Now, he's a terrible guy, like quite a terrorist sympathiser, and I don't want to sound like I'm defending him by any means, but all he did was basically what many of you may have done, or people of my generation may have done, which was Google the anarchist cookbook. It's just like a really terrible terrorist version of the anarchist cookbook in that sense, and I believe that it is impossible, if you've ever read the anarchist cookbook, I'm told that it is impossible to make drugs out of banana skins as well. So a lot of teenage disappointment. There. Now, we don't have a First Amendment, as you're all well aware, but we do have something called the freedom of political communication. In the early 90s, 2 cases in 1992, the High Court deduced that we had some form of freedom of speech. And they made the argument in quite an interesting way. They looked at the Constitution. They said, okay, well, this is the Constitution of a liberal democracy. How does a liberal democracy function? How do you have a democratic community? Well, you need some way to debate issues. So therefore, there has to be some fundamental right underpinning the Constitution, not appearing in the Constitution, in fact, explicitly rejected by the Constitution's founders, the Constitution's authors. But there's got to be something under there that says, well, there's a freedom of speech. And they said, okay, well, you as an Australian now have freedom of political communication. God knows what it means. The High Court certainly doesn't know what it means. There were these 2 cases. And there was another case where they developed a few more criteria by which the freedom of political communication could be used. And then it disappeared. People keep putting cases up, of course, but in between this case and December 2013, there have been no successful freedom of political communication cases at all. Do you remember the Pulling Pants Down song?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was a freedom of political communication case as well. Clearly satire, I would have thought, clearly political satire, clearly strong opinion, doesn't count as the freedom of political communication.
You probably not aware of this case because there's a WA Supreme Court one that you have to kind of...
I'm closely aware of the WA Supreme Court.
But the WA Liberal Party recently challenged local governments that restricted political signage on the basis of freedom of political communication.
Sure, okay.
And that was upheld by the West Australian Supreme Court.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that's good news.
Yeah.
That's good news. What was the grounds of contention?
That local councils were stopping political parties from putting up their signage unless it met certain rules.
Yeah, which were specifically designed so that they couldn't.
Yes, yeah. And the result of the case was that the rules for political parties should be no more onerous than for general commerce.
Okay.
So for real estate agents, because real estate agents were putting up signs everywhere, big signs, small signs, whatever, but political parties weren't allowed to purely political rather than commercial. And the way that it was interpreted was that the requirement should be no more onerous than for commerce.
And in fact, if they followed that through based on what we know of the rights of political communication. The political side should be much more free to do it because commercial signage, commercial stuff is not protected by political communication in the sense so specifically.
Has anyone investigated the degree to which we can go down the line that donations or money is speech, like they have the debate now?
So this was the issue at case in the union of concern in the Unions New South Wales case. Now, the Unions New South Wales case was a political funding case. It was a attempt by the New South Wales government basically to starve the Labor Party of its union support. It built all these rules about the circumstances where organisations can donate to political parties and organisations can donate to other politically affiliated organisations and so on and so forth. But it was a strict money is speech case. One of my favourite experiences was reading the Unions New South Wales arguments in front of the High Court, which was the most solid thing I've ever read in Australia. It was fantastic. It was, money, or at least the way you use your money, can be a form of expression and a form of political expression. I think this is a no-brainer because, of course, we make political statements with the things that we buy when you're buying fair trade or choosing not to buy fair trade, as the case might be. You're making a political statement, at least in some part. You're making a statement of your values and expression. This is a no-brainer to me. But the High Court found in a roundabout way that certainly is true. And I think when people start challenging more and more cases, more and more bad laws on those grounds, it'll be quite good. The most important thing to know about the freedom of political communication is you don't personally have it. It's not a personal right. It is not an individual right in the sense that the Romans believed in freedom of speech. It is a democratic right in the sense that the Athenians did. The most important thing is that we have the freedom of political communication so that our system of government, our democracy, can keep functioning. It's a right held by democracy, the state, the political community, rather than you and so forth. Now, I think this is completely incoherent, if that was your question. Sorry, please.
I was wondering if we can circumvent
democratic nature. So to that question, should the Nazis have freedom of speech? They would say no. There's a little nuance here. So this sounds all like, okay, fair enough, they're worried about sedition and so forth. The nuance is that they saw fascism in a very different way to we see fascism. For them, fascism was just strong capitalism. They thought that fascism was an outgrowth of capitalist extremism, whereas of course we see fascism as either an outgrowth of the far left or something, some totalitarian thing way off to the side. And they wanted to put that in the Declaration of Rights. They basically wanted to have the Declaration of Rights approve of their suppression of rights internally within the Soviet Union and within. There's a real buzz. Is everybody else hearing this?
I think if you stay closer to the microphone.
Stay closer or further away?
No, if you stay closer, it'll reduce the overall volume of it and you'll feedback less.
Oh, there is one on right here.
Yeah, this one's good.
What am I doing?
I don't think he needs it. We can hear it.
No, I don't want to do anything. I just want to use it. I just don't want to. I'm worried about your earbuds.
Turn them all off.
You, Mike, fantastic. Okay. Anyway, we won this argument. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights doesn't say that freedom of speech is banned if it's of an anti-democratic or fascist nature. But of course, that wasn't the end of the story. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is just a statement of principles. It's a bunch of feelings. It has no legal enforcement power. It was never intended to. It was just a statement. In 1966, the world got together again and they thought, okay, well, we set up this lovely statement of principles. Let's make it a bit of a law. Let's make it into international law. We had the same argument again. We lost. Australia was very, very good on this. The Menzies government was incredibly good on this. The rest of the Western world was incredibly good on this. in the Australian view, people cannot be legislated into morality. This is the argument they made at the United Nations. But these things go to a vote, and by 1966, the Soviet-aligned countries were larger and had stronger support than the Western countries. And as you can see here, any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. Discrimination, hostility, and violence. Well, okay. Violence, sure. Discrimination. How do you incite discrimination?
Don't sell the blacks.
No, you mentioned something that kind of like
Speech.
towards the
This is the whole idea. The idea that they created this concept of hate speech, which has turned the idea of action. You are acting to influence thoughts of others to do something else. You're inciting discrimination. Hate speech. We had the same issue again when there was a convention on the elimination of racial discrimination. And again, it's even more strident here. All states shall declare an offence punishable by law or dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority, hatred, or incitement to racial discrimination. Now you would have thought, okay, that's international law, fantastic, we can ignore it. Well, then there was the Whitlam government. We got the Racial Discrimination Act, 1975. Now, this was a big debate. The Whitlam government actually wanted to institute anti-hate speech laws within the Racial Discrimination Act, but it ended up waiting until the Racial Hatred Act of 1995, so the dying days of the Keating government, for them to institute what we now know as Section 18C, and of course its affiliated sections, so D and E as well. This was originally going to be a criminal law, but it was amended, thankfully. You were originally going to be able to go to jail for hate speech in Australia. That's thankfully not the case. Anyway, so you've seen all this quite a bit, I suspect. Section 18C, offend, insult, humiliate, or intimidate another person or group of people because of the race, colour, national, or ethnic origin. And so you make this argument, you say, well, you know, it's obscene that we would have a law against offence, it's obscene that we would have a law against insult, humiliate, yeah, that's pretty bad too. Yeah, intimidate. We're not so worried about intimidate. There's a lot of laws that protect against intimidation as it stands. That's what I view as crossing the boundary between words and action. We can get rid of this whole section, wipe the slate clean, because these three are unnecessary, and this, the one that people actually care about, and the one that when, you know, so the racist on the bus, which you would have seen the last couple of days, clearly intimidation. This is covered by criminal code at the state and Commonwealth level over and over and over. But anyway, so you make this argument to supporters of Section 18C, and the first thing they say, well, you're only talking about 18C, what about 18D? 18C does not render unlawful anything said or done reasonably in good faith. This is basically the exception. This is, well, yeah, no, we haven't put the freedom of speech, but it's fine. That's good. It strikes a balance. It strikes a balance.
I'm just curious about Section 18B. Does it apply to like artworks or movies or films?
The whole thing, all of this, all of Section 18C and D, they apply to any communication in any form.
Okay.
18D has a number of exceptions like that, it basically doubles down on the exceptions in a way. I haven't seen any cases where they've run the gamut in between those platform-specific ones, but you know. It also makes safety for political comment, but the key thing is, so there's a bunch of reasons that you get exceptions. This is only a small part of 18D. There's a bunch of reasons, if you're making political or social comment, all that sort of stuff, you can say whatever you want, as long as it's reasonable and in good faith. Those are the keys. As long as it's reasonable and in good faith. Guess who wasn't reasonable and in good faith? Andrew Bolt. So you're probably all very familiar with the Andrew Bolt case. I'm not going to overdo it. The title of the 3 articles is up there. You can Google them now, have a read, and see this big smacking notice at the bottom of them. Actually, it could be at the top from the federal court saying how it was in breach of the Racial Discrimination Act. The judge in that case made two key arguments. You've heard the first one, which is that he got his facts wrong. He shouldn't have got his facts wrong. Everybody agrees he should have got his facts wrong. If the wrong facts probably opened up for a case of defamation. But he also didn't do it in good faith because he made a strange tone. He was inflammatory and provocative. It was cynical, gratuitous, and derisive. He used sarcasm liberally. This is the thing. No. And the combination of the fact that he made mistakes and was gratuitous means that he was not making his argument in good faith. We don't know what the judge would have said if he'd only been sarcastic and got all the facts wrong, or he just made a shitload of mistakes. We don't know what that case would be. It'd be lovely to test the boundaries of this case. So anyway, as you well know, he was found to have breached the Racial Discrimination Act, and that's sad and really the courthouse. What's particularly obscene about this, and what's particularly offensive about the argument that AT&T provides an exception, and maybe if Bolt was a better journalist, he would have met those exceptions, is we have a judge deciding what tone we are allowed to make our arguments. It's actually worse than defamation in a lot of ways, or worse than he just gotten some mistakes. It's about the feelings. It's about a judge doing literary criticism at the same time. You can't predict how sarcastic your articles are. People say I'm quite sarcastic sometimes. I don't know, maybe. Anyway, so that's one of the big problems with Section 18D. And the key thing to know is that Bolt was excessively sarcastic. And that is one of the key reasons that he lost his case. But of course, there have been lots of other Section 18 C and D cases. A very famous one is Tobin versus Jones. This is the Holocaust denier, Frederick Tobin. An incredibly bad guy. Just an incredibly terrible person. He was found to have breached Section 18C quite early on. I think the first Tobin case was 1998, so it was very soon after 18C came into law. A lot of people have made the argument in recent months that, well, you know, if you're not rid of 18C, Holocaust denial will be legal. It is legal. It's not against the law. In fact, you wouldn't breach 18C for denying the Holocaust at all. The reason that he breached 18C was that he was also an incredible racist, and said all these horrible things about Jewish people, which of course was found to have breached 18C. But people like a lot of people have made the argument that, well, Holocaust denial was something illegal to get rid of 18C. These are two other cases you're probably not familiar with. To my mind, you can read it up there. Those are just descriptions of what actually happened. The first one was an altercation between a lawyer and a security guard, where the apparently very angry lawyer described the foreign-looking, I guess it must have been, security guard as a Singaporean prick on one occasion. Told the applicant that she knew he was from Singapore. Quite a detective, she obviously was. Anyway, for that case, she was found to have breached Section 18C. The other case, this is a family feud. Nothing more than a family feud where one clearly racist word was said. But anyway, it went all the way to the federal court. As you can see, and I'm glad that our tax is paid for that sort of thing. Michael Lavash was the Attorney General who put Section 18C through, and he argued that it's been a safety net for racial harmony. There are very few Section 18C cases. Most of them are pretty minor, as you can see. The ones that you don't hear about are pretty small. The Human Rights Commission hears a lot more, and they're even more minor. Again, Wally Ali, a very famous or very well-read column where he defended Section 18C made the point that it hasn't really done anything to anyway, it's a middle country. We're not exactly paying cutthroat states here. Where are we with Section 18C at the moment? We've had the Attorney General has released a proposal. It's a very clever proposal. It's a very complicated proposal. It pretty much gets any possible speech that you would want to say. Well, look, it gets any speech with very, very few exceptions that would make that completely lawful. It is almost as good as repealing 18C. The things it wouldn't get, things like that. It would only do the incredibly petty family feuds and the sort of things that are like the Adam Goods story where there was a racial epithet thrown at the player Adam Goods. Now that wasn't an 18C case, he didn't do anything with that, and we debated that for weeks, as you all know. It would probably cover that. So that would still be unlawful, and Adam Goods would be able to take a 14-year-old girl to the federal court if he really felt that was necessary. I don't think that the legislation is going to pass that. I think we've got a lot of work to do, but I suspect what's going to happen is they're going to water it down, and then it may or may not die in the Senate as well. The point being that defeating Section 18C is probably going to be a longer-term thing than a one-shot. We've heard Section 18C, I think, quite substantially, and we need to build on that over time. How will we go for time? We don't have much longer. I'm going to skip media regulation. We can talk about that after dinner if you like. That's Simon Green. That's going to be a good joke. All right. The one I'm particularly concerned about is this one. The government, as you know, has a freedom agenda. George Brandis is very proud to have said we have a freedom agenda coming out. The government's standing up for freedom of speech finally. The first thing that the government is going to do to stand up for freedom of speech, once it's wrapped up losing the debate, is going to institute a Child Safety Commission to ban things from social media websites. The idea is that people are being bullied on the internet. They argue that being bullied on the internet is worse than being bullied at school. It isn't. The evidence is very clear that it isn't. People who are bullied at school have more psychological harm than people who are bullied on the internet. And people who are bullied on the internet are being bullied at school as well. So they will hardly be tackling more issues. But from a freedom of speech perspective, the idea is that you're a child or you're a parent of a child who's being bullied on the internet, you'll be able to call up the freedom of speech. So the e-safety commissioner, who may or may not have a job, have a desk next to Tim Wilson, the freedom commissioner. that is not actually a joke. It's very, very likely that it will be housed, if it goes forward, it will be housed in the Human Rights Commission. You'll be able to call up the Children's e-safety commissioner and request that harmful content is removed from Twitter or Facebook or any of the other major social media ones very rapidly. The idea is it's going to be very fast. They're going to take it down really, really quick. Now, as I said, this gets the bullying problem all wrong. It gets the law all wrong as well. And this is something that I'm sometimes a bit reluctant to point out because it's a really bad law. But we have a cyberbullying law already. We're going to get another one. We have this one already. It is illegal to use carriage service. Illegal, so you go to jail for this. It is illegal to use carriage service to menace, harass, or cause offence. If you're familiar with the Man Modest case, this was the Muslim extremist who was sending letters to families of soldiers who died in Iraq, saying that he was glad they were dead and all that sort of thing. He went to jail under wasn't quite this code, but it's 474.15, which is using the postal service to menace, harass, and cause offence. It's a very serious law, and if you really, really want to send your bully to court and to jail, we already have that. More importantly, of course, against technology all wrong, the idea that you could delete something on Facebook and then it would delete from the entire internet seems optimistic to me. Look, I'm going to wrap it up there. I do have a number of other major concerns. We still have an internet filter. We're talking about anti-piracy measures. But I want to have like minutes for questions. So please buy my book and feel free to ask some questions.
So you talked a lot about crappy judgments, essentially.
Well, freedom of speech is a question of judgment. We live in
No,
a-
crappy judgments by digital interpretations. How do you feel about a statutory bill of rights?
Yes. I hate a statutory Bill of Rights. I like a constitutional Bill of Rights. People who talk about a statutory Bill of Rights.
Or bill of rights in general?
Okay, I'm supportive of the First Amendment. I want to take the First Amendment and smack bang in the middle of our Constitution. I don't really want to do anything more than that. But the First Amendment is one of the most powerful weapons for freedom of speech in the world. It is the only reason the United States is the only country not to have hate speech laws. It is a fantastically powerful thing. A lot of people make the argument, well, that just hands legislating power over to judges. I think that is a very optimistic view, as if legislative powers haven't been handed to judges. They made up the right to political communication as it was. I would like a chance to vote on that. Anyway, not so good about the Parliament. I'm not around to the Parliament. But there is a distinction between a statutory Bill of Rights and a constitutional Bill of Rights. Over the last couple of years, we've had this great debate about whether we should have a statutory Bill of Rights in Australia. For the Commonwealth, we have a statutory Bill of Rights in Victoria. There's good and bad elements in that Bill of Rights, but the real point is they ignore it whenever they want, because it's just another law. You can ignore your own laws. You can say, this bill overrides that bill. That's really easy to do. They do it all the time. If you have a constitutional one, that's really hard. That's a real Bill of Rights. If you want to create a rule that governments have to follow, you make it constitutional. It's got to be at the constitutional level. Otherwise, it's just some bullshit stuff.
That hasn't really worked with federalism, though, has it? They put it in the
No,
Constitution.
because the rules are terrible. The rules are absolutely shocking in the Australian federal system. But I take your point. No system is completely effective. There's no way that we're going to write one great rule that's going to fix liberty forever and ever. The Constitution, the First Amendment is a great example. The First Amendment was completely inert for 115 years. No, actually more than that. About 130 years. It didn't mean anything. They passed espionage laws. The Schenck versus United States, that was an espionage law justified under the First Amendment, where they decided that people who protest against conscription don't get First Amendment protection. It's only been in the last 90 or so years that the First Amendment's been a real thing. So no system.
Chris, you draw a distinction between something that's illegal in the sense of a crime and in the sense of something that's simply illegal, like 18C. Is that a fair distinction to make? I mean, if Mr. Bolt, for example, breaches the order against him, ordering him not to publish his work, that's a contempt of court, which is jail time.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what happened to Tony. It's important to make that distinction between civil offences and criminal offences, but ultimately, what the state decides goes. A lawyer would say, well, you haven't breached 18C, you've breached the court order.
It's a distinction without a difference for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you completely, but there's a two-stage process to do that. It is still very important, particularly when you argue about these things, to make the distinction. It's not illegal to breach 18C, it's unlawful. You're likely to be able to take a civil action. I know it might be a distinction without difference, but unfortunately it's one of those things that people who are arguing against 18C always stuff up, and it makes them look like, oh, it's illegal to do what 18 will do. No, not 10.
Okay, time for a couple more quick questions.
Just go about thought becoming action, like a bit different to inciting or threatening, I guess, or on the same level. What's your opinion regarding crimes of conspiracy, and I guess when does thought become action in that sense?
To be honest, it's not one I've thought a great deal about, but I mean, the intention to commit a crime is unlawful or illegal, and the idea that you would group a number of people together to do so. I have no problem with accomplice caused by anything. Look, we need to be reasonable about these things, and we also there is a jurisprudential principle with a lot of freedom of speech cases that if there is a compelling state interest, then it will make an exception to that as well. And compelling state interest would be the prevention of criminal activity. I know there are a lot of people that have lots of strong views about. I think it's FISA in the US. No, not FISA. The RICO. It's not something I've been open to.
So one more.
And insults could cause harmful changes to the neurology in the brain. Does that therefore constitute harm exploitation?
No. This is one of the problems that's happened since everybody knows the harm principle. Everybody knows John Stewart's harm principle. Now, of course, he developed the harm principle in his argument that we need to maximise the range of freedom of speech. Everybody turns around and goes, well, there's psychological harm. That's a social change that we've made to recognise the existence of social harm. But I don't think that you can have a society where individual consciousnesses are respected and made to work in a communal sense if you're making the expression of just opinion a prohibited. So I think that's one of the arguments that you get. Oh, we're done? Okay, sorry, John.
Just a suggestion with Scott Ludlam's quote, if you put in the ellipsis and cut out a few more words, at the end you can just say illuminated.
I like Scott.